charge. There are envelopes in the lobby if you would like to donate, or donations can be made online. This center is for all of us. Please join with me in support. Before introducing Dr. Leff, I have to remind you that we have an extra lecture tomorrow. This week at 12:30 on Wednesday, which is already tomorrow, Richard Gitlin has a lecture for us entitled, "We Are Not Fighting Discrimination, We Are Fighting Elimination." Richard Gitlin is the founder and president of the Nagin Project, a nonprofit focusing on united Jewish community to combat anti-Semitism with a cohesive strategy. Also on Wednesday, we have another showing of our movie. This is My Mother, La Vie de Mère de ma Mère. It's at 3:30, so we hope to see you there. Finally, please be sure to silence all your cell phones and electric devices. Following yesterday's wonderful presentation of a man who salvaged French Jewish history, today's presentation by Dr. Lisa Leff is entitled France and the Jews, a history of a love-hate relationship. Dr. Leff is the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for the Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She is a professor of history at the American University and an expert on French Jewish history. Professor Leff has served as president of the Society for the French Historical Studies, as a board member of the Association of Jewish Studies, and as an elected fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research, among others. Please join me in providing a warm Chautauqua welcome for Dr. Lisa Leff.
Thank you so much for the introduction and all the hospitality. I'm so happy to be back and talking to you about the long history of France and the Jews. I have PowerPoint. Let's get it up there. Are you having trouble hearing? Is this okay? Yeah. Okay, good. I'll get closer. I know you're supposed to kiss the mic. It's always intimidating. For more than 20 years, there has been a rising tide of anti-Semitism in France. And I'm just going to run through a few examples so that you can remember what I'm talking about. In January 2015, an armed gunman stormed into a kosher grocery store in Paris on Friday afternoon when people were shopping for Shabbos dinner. He murdered 4 Jewish shoppers and held 15 others hostage. The police stormed the supermarket, killing the gunman. In March 2018, an 85-year-old Holocaust survivor named Mireille Knoll was stabbed 11 times and then set on fire by her 29-year-old neighbor, who she had known his entire life. He had grown up next door to her. He had brought a friend with him into her apartment. The friend apparently said, "She's a Jew, she'll have money." The 2 suspects accused each other. One claimed that the other one shouted Allah Akbar as he stabbed her. Third story, just a few months ago in March of this year, the chief rabbi of Orléans, a town in France, Aryeh Engelberg, was walking home from Shabbat morning services with his 9-year-old son, He was attacked when coming out of the synagogue by a 16-year-old immigrant from Morocco. Engelberg said that his attackers asked him if he was Jewish, and Engelberg, wearing his kippah, walking out of synagogue, said, "Yes, I am." The teen apparently said, "All Jews are sons of blankety blanks," and told the rabbi he wanted to film him with his phone as he hurled insults. He was completely unrepentant. All of the questions were whether he could stand trial because of his mental fitness. Eventually, he was condemned to 16 months in prison just this April. So this is just a few of the stories, and if you read the newspaper, there's a lot of these stories. And there's a lot, this is going back 20 years in one way or another, but there has been a tremendous increase since October 7th. So here are some numbers that the French Ministry of the Interior has kept. In 2022, you can see these numbers here, 436 crimes. In 2023, 1,676. In 2024, 1,570. So a huge increase after October 7. In 2024, 65% of all attacks related to religion, so hate crimes related to religion, were against Jews. Jews represent less than 1% of the French population, and yet 65% of hate crimes are against Jews right now. In 2024, the Jewish Community Protection Service reported that more than 10% of these crimes are violent, physically violent, so crimes against persons rather than against property. So what is going on? Well, to some extent, what we see today, and especially since October 7th, is fanned by what's going on in Israel-Palestine. It also has to do with the rise of radical Islamist ideology in Europe, which has really taken root, especially in French prisons, where there's a lot of passing of this ideology. But what I want to talk to you about today is some other causes. This alone cannot explain what we are seeing in France. These stories that I just told you, and the many others that I didn't tell you, are not all radical Islamist fanatics. They are not shouting "Free Palestine," right? There is something else going on. The question is, what? To understand that, I propose that we look more broadly at the conversation about anti-Semitism in France. We have also seen many state leaders in France and many large demonstrations of non-Jewish citizens defending Jews in the name of the Republic, as you can see here in this demonstration. This demonstration was organized by the two heads of the French Parliament in November 2023, a month after October 7. And you can see here this big sign that says, "The Republic Against Anti-Semitism." Jews clearly symbolize something in French culture. Today we're going to look historically to try to understand just what that is. And I should say, this isn't the first time that we've seen anti-Semitism in France, what's going on right now. But I should say, about 20 years ago, when all of this really started, it came as a huge shock to French Jews who had become very used to thinking of France in a different way. In fact, France had a tremendously positive reputation among Jews until quite recently. I start here with World War II. During World War II, France saw itself as a nation that resisted the Nazi occupation, and that reputation as a nation of résistants extended to having sort of disproportionately engaged in the rescue and help provided to French Jews when the Nazis started really persecuting them. So if you just look at something that French people 50 years ago would have told you is that when the Nazis started persecuting the Jews in France and wanted to deport them and round them up, France actually had a relatively high survival rate. So 75% of French Jews survived the Nazi occupation, as opposed to, say, Poland, where only 10% of Polish Jews survived the Nazi occupation. Or even the Netherlands, right, where there were so many helpers, only 20% of Dutch Jews survived the Holocaust. So this relatively high percentage, and we'll talk more about this. People thought, for many years, this showed that, yes, a terrible thing happened, the Nazis were here, many, many people died, but ordinary French people and the true France were always on the side of help. Even before that, even before World War II, in the 1920s and 30s, when the United States, for example, closed its doors to immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe, France remained a country of refuge, one of the few countries that remained open to immigration from Eastern Europe. So many, many Jews who were fleeing persecution from Poland, from Romania, from Germany, from Austria and Czechoslovakia, they went to France in the 20s and 30s. In fact, France's Jewish population doubled between 1920 and 1940, and that was because of just how many Jews from Eastern and Central Europe saw France as their place of refuge. In fact, even going back to the 19th century, there was an enduring common wisdom among Jews in Europe that France was the home of the revolution. It was the home of democracy. Its slogan was liberty, equality, fraternity, and that included Jews too. And that's why we have this Yiddish expression, which some of you may know, Leben wie Gott in Frankreich, to live like God in France. The Yiddish speakers would say to one another, if only we could live so well, where we would have equality, freedom. People would treat us like real members of society. That's what democracy meant. The democratic tradition, the commitment to secularism, had long made France have a very positive, Jews viewed France in very positive terms. So what I've laid out before you here is a certain ambivalence. At times, the French have been the main defenders of Jewish rights in the world in the name of those democratic ideals, and Jews have seen it that way. And on the other hand, many times in French history, France has been the home to a hateful and violent anti-Semitism. How do we account for this love-hate relationship? And this is especially interesting when you take into account the actual Jewish population, the numbers, how many Jews lived in France. Today, I said it's less than 1%. To be more specific, somewhere around 500,000 Jews live in France. It's the third biggest Jewish population in the world. Out of an overall French population of 68 million, that's 0.7%. Right? In America, we're more like 2.5%. This is tiny. In 1940, on the eve of the Holocaust, there were 350,000 Jews in France out of 40 million. Also about the same, 0.7%. All the way back in 1789, which is going to become relevant in a moment when I talk about the revolution, there were only 40,000 Jews in France out of a total population of 28 million. I'm watching all of you math, some of you have math. Can you do it? I'm just trying to get my students to do it. Can you do it? Can you do it? It's about 0.1%, 1/10 of 1%. And yet, as I'm about to show you, Jews have been incredibly visible and important in French public life. People talk about Jews a lot. they see Jews a lot, and Jews have a strong symbolic meaning in that culture. So that's what we want to look at today. France was the first country to give Jews citizenship, and that happened during the Revolution, and it's one of the places where Jews have been most visible. And I want to start here. You can see them in positions of real authority. There have been more Jewish political heads of state or political leaders of different sorts in France than any other country other than Israel. This includes 3 Jewish prime ministers of France. Here are 2 of them. Léon Blum was the prime minister of France and the head of the Socialist Party in the 1930s. In 1953, René Meyer was the prime minister. And then in the 1950s, and here's the other man pictured, Pierre Mendès France, who was a centrist. The other thing that, let me take a second to point out, they come from 3 different political parties. There's not a Jewish voting bloc traditionally in France. They're across political parties, but very visible and being elected to the highest position in the country. From my perspective, it's even more notable that Jewish politicians occupied high positions in French electoral life going all the way back to the 1840s, when Jews were elected to parliament, and not by Jewish voters. They're representing regions where there are no Jews. So you have several Jewish deputies elected in the 1840s, a time I would note where in certain states, in the United States, like Connecticut, Jews couldn't vote. So it's like a really interesting contrast. In 1848, there was a revolution in France in 1848 that briefly established a republic. Well, in that government in 1848, there was a ruling group of 5 cabinet positions, and of those 5 men, 2 were Jews. Isn't that astonishing? Isn't that absolutely astonishing? So since the 1840s, Jews prominent in French politics, people willing to elect Jews, and very knowing that they were Jewish. Let's talk about the stage for a moment. Since the 19th century, Jews have been super visible on the theater stage. Here are just 2 Jews who were known to be Jewish, made a lot of their Jewishness. In fact, one of them is Sarah Bernhardt, and the other is Rachel, who was so famous she dropped her last name to just go by Rachel. In fact, when she was born, her name was Elisa Felix, but her middle name was Rachel, and she decided, and she was right, that she would make a lot more money and be a lot more popular if everyone understood that she was a beautiful Jewess, right? That's what made her famed. Every time there was a newspaper article about her, of course they would talk about her beautiful, passionate, dark, brooding eyes and her Jewish looks. That's what made her famous. She also had tuberculosis, which is probably the deal with the eyes. Even in the 20th century, Jews have been very visible in French popular culture. Serge Gainsbourg is one of France's most famous singers of the 20th century, so is Barbara. Both of them, well known to be Jewish, made a lot of their Jewishness as part of their fame. So all this I'm just pointing out to say 0.7% of the population aside, very visible, a lot of positive publicity that goes far beyond the proportions of their population. This symbolism, the meaning of Jews, talking about Jews, seeing Jews, Jews being important, actually goes back a really long way. Let me go back all the way to the 18th century, the Enlightenment. I have a colleague, a scholar named Ron Schechter, who wrote a wonderful book that I'm advertising here called Obstinate Hebrews. And in this book, Ron says, even in the Enlightenment, reform-minded writers, Diderot, D'Alembert, Rousseau, Voltaire, the men of the Enlightenment, wrote more about Jews than they did about the English, their sworn enemies. Ron actually did a statistical study where he ran all the Enlightenment texts that he could find online through, he did a search for the word Jew and its cognates, and then he did a separate search for England and English and its cognates, and he said the number of hits for Jew just dwarfed England and English. He says, he concludes from that, the Enlightenment thinkers were obsessed with the Jews. That's the term he used. And he argues that this was because for Enlightenment thinkers, Jews were especially good, the term he uses is good to think. Any question that you had in the Enlightenment, like, can people be improved? Does climate have effect on personality? How can we make a government that's good for all? For all of these questions, Jews were good to think. They were the kind of limit about social inclusion. If you're making a general rule, you would ask yourself, can this include even the Jews? That's why Jews were good to think for Enlightenment thinkers, for the kinds of issues they were interested in. They would always invoke the Jews. And even Voltaire, who's remembered by many as having written terrible things about the Jews, one way of reading the critiques that Voltaire had of the Jews, what he said about the Jews is they're very dogmatic. One way of reading that, the way we normally read that is, in an era of high censorship, when there was no way you could criticize the Catholic Church, the way to criticize the church was to criticize the Jews. It was a critique of all religious dogmatism. And if everyone who read Voltaire in the 18th century would understand his critique is of religious dogmatism. But what this meant was that the Enlightenment really had a very strong discourse on Jews. And that discourse extended to the revolutionaries. In 1789, the men who made that revolution, which created democracy, it created human rights, it created the idea that all men are equal before the law, these men were very influenced by Enlightenment writing. And they too were obsessed with the Jews. In fact, in the first months of the revolution, the revolutionaries, as they're creating a completely new government, turned time and again to discuss the question, what are we going to do about the Jews? Eventually, one of the reasons why they were so obsessed with the Jews is one of the things they wanted to do was wrest control away from the Catholic Church. France had been an absolute monarchy where the king was the embodiment of God on earth. Now they want to have a democratic constitutional monarchy. And the church should be in less of a position of authority. So that question, what do we do about the Jews? Could even the Jews be citizens? Became the question around which secularism was created. Those were the debates. Revolutionaries couldn't decide. Some thought, of course, Jews are men, so they must be included. And others said, even the Jews? But eventually that universalist thinking prevailed, and Jews were made citizens early in the revolution and remained that way. And that question, what about the Jews? Here's an engraving from the time of Napoleon bestowing citizenship on the Jews. This question made Jews an enduring symbol of what the Republic stood for. It was more universal than Catholicism. If you want to make a society that can include everyone, you make a big deal that it's even the Jews. Jews. And that's why in the 19th century, as the monarchists are fighting the partisans of the Republic, the Republicans are always saying, we're on the side of a society that includes all, and the proof of all is the Jews. In fact, after Napoleon, France slid back into a monarchy until 1848, when there was a new short-lived revolution that established a republic yet again. And let's look at the PR for that revolution. I said, in that revolution, 2 of the leaders of France were Jewish. Here's who they sent around to do a theater tour. That's Rochelle. And she went around France carrying this, the flag, the tricolor flag, which is the symbol of the Republic, got down like this. I've seen pictures of it, like on bended knee, doing a spoken word performance of the Marseillaise, France's national anthem that's associated with the Republic. A very Jewish symbol of the Republic. This symbolism was really important in French politics in the 19th century, and I've already mentioned it's especially associated with secularism and the struggle to displace Catholicism as meaningful in politics. So here we have, when France finally established a lasting republic and displaced its monarchs for good, you have great examples of it. So the man who was you're not surprised now that there were deputies who were Jewish. On the left, Alfred Naquet was in the Republican camp, and he was the man that his party decided should introduce the bill legalizing divorce. Why divorce? Well, that's a Catholic issue, right? It's a Jew who introduced the divorce bill. On the right is Leon Gambetta. Leon Gambetta is remembered as the most important French deputy in leading the charge to secularize French education and French public life. He was a lawyer from the South, and he was not Jewish, but when you read the press from the time, everyone assumed he was. They call him the Jew Gambetta. And that just tells you that what this is about is the struggle for the soul of the Republic, right? Jews are particularly potent as a symbol in foreign policy, and what I'm going to talk about right now, colonial policy. France started building an empire in the 19th century, and the jewel in the crown for France was Algeria, which was conquered by the French in 1830. And Jews were crucial in the symbolism of what these French, proponents of democracy said they were doing there. So not only, already in the Napoleonic Empire, did Napoleon say, I'm building an empire, and everywhere I go, I'm liberating the Jews, and he broke down the ghetto walls in Italy and elsewhere. But when the French went to Algeria, they actually granted full citizenship rights to Algerian Jews. That is to say, Jews who traced their ancestry, like had been living in North Africa for hundreds of years, were made full Frenchmen with the right to vote. Muslims never were. And it was a Jew, Adolf Kremia, who, as Minister of Justice, and again, you shouldn't be surprised, France had a Minister of Justice in 1870, yeah. This Jewish man said, this is what France does. It liberates Jews everywhere. Not necessarily seeing the strange irony of, if France is so universal, why not the Muslims? That's a question that didn't get asked at that time. So this idea that Jewish emancipation is identified as the heart of what the Republic stood for in the world was incredibly well established by the end of the 19th century. That was the Republican movement. And And what happened next was that this very logic, Jews are the symbol of the Republic, helping Jews is what the Republic is all about in the world, got inverted by a new movement that started in Algeria. Now, colonial Algeria, French colonial Algeria, was not only home to 3 million Muslims and about 30,000 Jews, it was also became home to many European settlers who came from France, but also European settlers who came from Italy and Spain and Malta. And they were privileged. They had been privileged in the law, and they were acquiring land at the expense of the local Arabs. In 1870, when Adolphe Premier gave Jews, native Jews, French citizenship, they were very angry. These European settlers, white settlers. These European white settlers had considered themselves superior because of their whiteness and because of their Catholicism. And these native Jews, they said, these Arab Jews, getting citizenship before they had citizenship was an outrage to them. So they created a movement that they called the anti-Juif movement. They didn't use the word anti-Semitism, which already existed and was being used in Germany, but they wanted to distinguish. They had nothing wrong. They had no problem with Arabs, right? Their problem was with Jews. And their claim was the Republic back in Paris was in the hands of Jews, was a Jewish conspiracy against good Catholic people who should have full rights. Recognize this kind of claim? It's an inverse of what the Republicans themselves were claiming. It wasn't really that the Republic was a Jewish conspiracy, but the symbol of Jews was being used in that way. And now, to oppose the Republic, you call it Jewish, right? With the Dreyfus Affair, so this movement is in the 1880s. In 1894, a Jewish army officer named Alfred Dreyfus was falsely accused of selling state secrets to the Germans. France was divided. Many, many people, who were right, by the way, said he was framed because he was a Jew. But others, the anti-Dreyfusards, said Dreyfus is guilty. It proves that Jews are unreliable. And anyone who would say otherwise is in the hands of the Jews. We must fight this false republic, which is a Jewish conspiracy. They're using Jews as a negative symbol of what's wrong with the democracy. And this movement really gets going with the Dreyfus Affair, which is, a struggle for the soul of France between those who want state secularism, equality for all, and those who think things have gone too far. We need to get power back into the hands of the Catholics. And the claim that arises there that we still see so much today is that the Republic is a tool for Jews to exploit to their own ends to make money. This movement really gets going in the 1890s with the Dreyfus Affair, and it stays very powerful, grows in the 1930s. It is an indigenous fascist movement, and what you have to understand about French anti-Semitism, so by the time it comes back to France, they call themselves anti-Semites, not just anti-Jews, but they have, is that by the 1830s and 40s, it's more than just rhetoric. When the Nazis occupy France, indigenous anti-Semites come into positions of power, create collaboration with the Nazis, and they are a lot of the force behind France developing its own politics to get rid of Jews, right? Because they've long held this anti-Semitic belief that Jews are foreigners, don't belong here, and are controlling power in order to make money. So the other way of going, I said we would go back to this question of what was France in World War II, and I previously mentioned France saved 3/4 of its Jews, 75%. We have to also look at it the other way, right? French authorities allowed for, and in many cases helped, deport 1/4 of France's Jews, disproportionately the immigrants. 77,000 Jews were deported from France to Nazi death camps in Eastern Europe and Poland, only 2,800 of whom came back. Right? So 1/4 of France's Jews were killed in the Holocaust. And some of that was helped by this indigenous tradition of, and I'm going to say a term here that I hope you'll take away from my talk, anti-Republican anti-Semitism. A kind of anti-Semitism that is so powerful because what it hates is the state itself. It sees the state as in the hands of the wrong people. Okay, so to try to wrap this up, what I've talked about, I hope, helps account for why France has such a strong love-hate relationship with the Jews. It is because Jews are a symbol of something. They're a symbol of the very meaning of France. What is this democracy all about? It's as old as the secular state itself. It goes back to the Enlightenment and the Revolution. It's the heart of the struggle between the church and the partisans of secularism in France. It's what the partisans of secularism say is right about their movement. And even today, this symbolism is still there. So this is what I wanted to bring you to add to the way you understand the explosion of anti-Semitism in France. Let's look for a moment at how state authorities in France have responded to the rise of anti-Semitism. In 2003, parenthetically, when I, as a scholar, kept on saying, oh, don't worry about anti-Semitism in France, it's just a blip, it's not a rising tide, etc., that's wrong. Don't ever ask historians about the present, by the way. There was a bombing of a Jewish school when there were no kids there. And President Jacques Chirac, who was a conservative, said, attacking a Jew in France is an attack on all of France. It's very interesting, a conservative would say that. In 2015, after that attack on the Jewish grocery store, Prime Minister Manuel Valls, who's on the left, said, if 100,000 Jews leave France, France will no longer be France. The French Republic will be judged a failure. From right and left, France's leaders say France without the Jews is not France. Manuel Valls said this because Netanyahu came to France and gave a speech at the synagogue and said, Jews, you're not safe here, come to Israel. And this was Valls' response. He said, I'm the son of Spanish immigrants myself, and if all the Spaniards leave, France will still be France, but the Jews cannot leave. France will not be France. This is what it means to be a republic. And Macron, the current head of France, has taken the same line, saying in the wake of these horrible rise of anti-Semitism since October 7th, that the republic depends on fighting anti-Semitism. I want to go back to this nationwide marches that took place in November 2023. Before I showed you the picture of the march in Paris, this is the march in the southern city of Marseille. And I wanted to show you the sign here. Wait, hold on. This one. Do we have French readers here? Anti-Semitism equals republic in danger. It's the same rhetoric. It's hundreds of years of seeing anti-Semitism as a threat to the very nature of French democracy. And we have to understand that anti-Semites and Philo-Semites are still talking about the same thing, which is the fate of the French Republic itself. And Jews themselves also use this language to talk about what's going on. This was a march back in 2012 when there had been a terrible attack on a Jewish school. This is the aftermath of that. This is the United Jewish Students of France, a big Jewish organization. And they're carrying a sign that says, "When Jews are assassinated, the Republic is in danger." Historically, insistence on Jews at the heart of the Republic is the most typical one you will see French Jews adopt. It makes Jews integral to the very identity of France. This is the love part of the love-hate relationship. But as I hope you understand now, symbolism can go exactly the other way. To critique the Republic, if you're anti-Republican, if you're against what's happening, or you see government as a mess and you want to attack it, what do? You attack the Jews. And that is also what we're seeing today. That's the language that's available for people to use. The fact that Jews mean this in France is very, I don't know what to make of it. It's both wonderful and it's terrifying. For me as a historian, it makes it so much more interesting to study them. Because even though the population of Jews is so small in this country, what has been said about them by both their friends and their enemies is crucial for understanding how France sees itself. Thank you.
If you have any questions for Dr. Leff, I'm going to pass the microphone around. Please speak into it so that the people outside can hear you as well. Anybody else?
Forgive me if I missed it, but France has also had an historic commitment to secularism, and how has that affected the Jews and how they fit into that?
To secularism, yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the main things that Jews are the symbol of, right? It's a democracy that doesn't have religion as the cornerstone in public life. And so to make the reason for that, right, to rationalize that, Jews have been really symbolically important. And it's interesting because you would think that Jews would erase their Jewishness. That's what we usually say. Jews erase their Jewishness from their public identity. But what I've shown you should show that's not exactly true. Actually, Jews are a symbol of secularism, of France's secularism, so they have to kind of make something of their Jewishness. It's paradoxical, but it's true. Like, how else do you understand Rachel with the flag and like spoken word Marseillaise? Her Jewishness is what shows that this republic is secular, because secularism is about fighting Catholicism. How else do you show that this is not a Catholic state than to say, look, a Jew represents it? And it's like you can see how, whoa, that gets flipped around when Catholics start to mobilize for a different kind of democracy. Right? And that's what happens in the 1890s.
You have a question right
Yeah.
Do you see any parallels in this country? Do you see any parallels
To this
happening in
country?
the United States to what you described in France?
So I would have, if we were here, 10 years ago, first of all, I would have said, no, there's no rising tide of anti-Semitism. Okay, so wrong about that. And I also would have said, no parallels to the United States, because in American public life, Jews are not a visible symbol of democracy. And while there's always been anti-Semitism in America, it wasn't political, it was social. It was about, you can't stay in this hotel. It wasn't about the very meaning of the American Democratic Republic. right? And that may be because of our tradition of religious pluralism. One of the things that is very interesting and disturbing lately is that we are seeing more of this. That this new wave of anti-Semitism in the United States is starting to look something like this, is more an attack on our democracy. Some of the conspiracies that we see, for example, I just read about a conspiracy theory that Biden was in the hands of the Jews because his cabinet was all Jews or secret Jews. This is false, but it is so similar, right? There's a wonderful French scholar that I've worked with a lot named Pierre Birnbaum, and he also writes in English, and he's just written a book called Tears of History about American anti-Semitism, where he talks about how this French model, we're starting to see signs of it here too. And I really recommend it to you. It's a new book.
So a number of years ago, a number of us went on an extensive tour of Israel, and we had tour guides, etc. And we were noticing all these multi-million-dollar high-rises that were being built in Tel Aviv and other places in Israel. And we were told a lot of them are French Jews who are not moving to Israel but want a place to go because they were convinced that eventually, just like what happened in the early 1940s, they will be kicked out of France, and they need a place to go, and so they were buying apartments and condos and homes so that when they get kicked out, their family have a place to go.
Mm-hmm. So I think I mentioned that in 2015, Netanyahu came to the biggest synagogue in Paris and gave this talk and said, "It is time to go." And the Jews who were there to hear him in the great synagogue on Rue de la Victoire in Paris, I don't know if any of you remember how they responded, but they broke out in singing the Marseillaise. And very moving. And yet at the same time, many of them were making Aliyah, right? No, I don't know if it was the same people. And there are a lot of different ways to understand this phenomenon, but it is definitely happening. You know, one way to understand it is many people, like the flight from Paris to Tel Aviv is like a little under 4 hours. So some people in the United States, like who live up here, maybe they go to Miami, you know, for some of the year. There is that aspect. There's even, they talk about a phenomenon called Boeing Aliyah, meaning you're kind of going back and forth. But even, and some of it is, you know, people have family in Israel, it's nicer weather in Israel, you like it there, but maybe your business is in France. How serious is it? On the other hand, there is a very serious element. You talk to French Jews today, whether they're tracing their origins to North Africa, or they're Ashkenazi, they trace their roots to Eastern Europe, or maybe they go back centuries in France. They are scared and anxious. Whether Israel is the answer or not, I think what you said is really true. There are so many French Jews in Israel now that they sometimes call the neighborhood, the Marais, the Jewish neighborhood in Paris, they sometimes call it Little Jerusalem.
Is it reasonable to speculate what the world would be like today if throughout Europe during the 30s and 40s, everybody had, including Jews, had Second Amendment rights?
Mm. Yeah.
You showed us numbers of anti-Semitic acts in the last few years in France. I'm curious how much of them originated among the gigantic Muslim population that immigrated to France, and how much of that came from the sort of the indigenous French population.
Yeah. One of the really interesting things about France is that it has the largest population of Jews alongside the largest population of Muslims of any country in Europe. So there are about 6 million Muslims in France and about 500,000 Jews in France. And that makes it a super interesting place. Many of these Jews and Muslims, their families had immigrated from North Africa. Sometimes they're living in suburbs of cities, like suburbs of Paris, alongside people from their same village, whose grandparents came from the same villages in Algeria or Tunisia or Morocco. And those are places where a lot of the tensions started. That these are contestations or tensions over their different receptions in France. That Jews, when they moved to France, had Jewish institutions in France that welcomed them, helped them get a leg up, and Muslims went to refugee centers, and it was much harder for them. So that's the way, that's like the most common way that you'll read in the press that people talk about, like, why is there tension? Well, it's not really France. This is really North Africa displaced into France. And I don't want to deny that. I think that's part of the story. But I think when you read the political culture, you have to say, yeah, but this is taking place in France. And France has a long tradition of anti-Semitism that even these new arrivals are assimilating into. And whether they're Muslim or Catholic or nothing, anti-Semites today are adopting a language to express their discontent with the Republic. It's failure. It's failure to take care of all of its people and to live up to its promises. And the easiest way in French political symbolic language to express that is to say, the Republic, its ideals are right, but something's gone wrong. Someone is profiting from this machinery of bureaucracy, and that's why I'm not being helped. That's why I'm dissatisfied and not included. Who could possibly be benefiting behind the scenes? Who's rich? Who's got money? Even if it's just a little more than me, it's the Jews. Right? That's why it's a powerful, that's why that French context is so important.
On a different note, I recently watched a series on HBO Max called Reformed.
Oh, I know.
About the French rabbi, based on a real French rabbi. And it was delightful and very enlightening, but I wondered how it was received in France.
So I just stumbled on this too. It's about Delphine Orvilleur, the wonderful American-trained, we can claim her sort of too. One of the first French women on the pulpit as a rabbi, and it's like a story. This show, Reformed, is a television series based on her, and I have no idea how it's been. I talked to a French friend, she hadn't heard of it. So it's like, you must watch this. We must all watch this.
Is there any parallel anti-Muslim issues in
There
France?
is
And how
a
does
huge
it
amount
compare?
of, right, there is a huge amount of racism against Muslims, and it takes a different form. The racism against Muslims in France is systematic and difficult, right? It is a real history. It never claims that Muslims control the Republic. It says they don't belong here, they're not as good, they're criminals, all of that kind of thing. Not they're secretly pulling the levers of our democracy.
Thank you all.
I'd like to thank Dr. Lutt for being here and providing the insights and enlarging our world. Thank you very much. We're very grateful.
Well, you go, or I gotta get back here.